Welcome to this episode of KiniTalk. I'm Temily Tianmei, and today I'll be chatting via Skype with Sudhir Vadaketh from Singapore. Now, he's the author of Floating on a Malayan Breeze, and Sudhir is Singaporean. He left to study at Berkeley and Harvard after completing his military service. But before he did that, he took an interesting trip which resulted in this book. Sudhir decided that he wanted to know what the real Malaysia was like, as opposed to what they're told across the border. So he and a friend decided to cycle around Peninsula Malaysia for a month on a budget of 10 ringgit per day. Now, Sudhir was also a senior editor with the Economist Intelligence Unit, but he's now transitioning to full-time writing. Sudhir, thank you for joining us today.
Thanks.
Now, your book looks at the intertwined destinies of Malaysia and Singapore, but I think what's interesting too is that you use the word Malayan, and I notice in your blog as well, you refer to yourself as a Malayan author, Malayan issues. Why use this term? And I ask this in light of the recent political campaigning where politicians in Sabah were raising the issue of Malaya again. So I just want to clarify what your position is on this.
No, I was born in Singapore, but I have very close ties to Malaysia. My dad was born in Malaysia. I have lots of relatives there. So I've always felt a strong affinity for Malaysia, and I've always sort of been trying to hark back to the days when we were still sort of one country. And so my use of the term Malaya is just simply because I feel this strong sort of kinship with the country, and I suppose, more than that, I also feel that over the past 30 to 40 years, Singapore has, instead of really getting closer to Malaya, it's in many ways actually, ideologically, philosophically, how Singaporeans think of themselves and think of identity. Singapore has actually moved in some ways away from Malaysia. Now, there are very obvious political and historical reasons why, from 1965 onwards, Singaporean leaders felt the need to move away from Malaysia. But that it's also, I've always felt sort of a sense of regret about the fact that our countries have not been as close as I think they should be. After all, we were the same country in a sense for many centuries. So it's also that sense of regret about Singapore not being as Malayan as I would have liked us to.
Do fellow Singaporeans there kind of not like it when you use that term though? Because like you said, Singapore's trying to differentiate itself from Malaysia. So when you use that term there, what's the reaction like?
No, I mean, different reactions. I think a lot of the older generation, they actually feel this sense of romance when they hear me using the word Malaya. I spoke with many older Chinese, older Malays, older Indians, Singaporeans who are actually very pleased that I use the word Malaya. For them also it brought back memories of pre-1965 and the old days when life was quite different. Small things about life. Malay, for instance, was used a lot more commonly in ordinary, everyday conversation. So I think for some older Singaporeans, there was this romantic notion of Malaya, which they quite liked. For a lot of the younger generation, I suppose I'm quite unique in having these fairly strong ties to Malaysia. A lot of the younger generation, they told me they were interested by my use of the word Malaya, but at the same time, they didn't feel, anywhere near as strong a bond as I did with Malaysia. You can meet a lot of younger Singaporeans today who are, much more comfortable traveling to Hong Kong or to London or the US than they are actually, walking around KL. So it differs depending on the generation, but also, there were some people who perhaps had associate the word Malaya with the British and with colonialism. So there was a small segment of people as well who felt that, it reminded them of the colonial days, for better or for worse.
Now, so talking about your trip though, you set out to discover the real Malaysia. And of course, your whole book tells of so many experiences and short stories in there. But what was the one thing that was most surprising or shocking that you didn't expect to learn in that trip?
I suppose the thing that was most interesting, and my bicycle trip was in 2004, And, back then I had a very strong conviction that, Malaysia's Bumiputra system was unfair because it, gave preferences to one race over the others. What I didn't expect to hear was many Malaysians actually describing to me how Singapore's system is unfair. I was a kind of a naive, proud Singaporean who felt that our meritocratic system was kind of the only way to go. And what was interesting is I had many conversations with people who actually criticized the Singapore system because of the fact that we don't actually try to help those at the bottom in a very active way. So, in Singapore, there's no active redistribution of income towards those at the bottom of the ladder. And I think that was one of the fundamental differences between, Malaysia and Singapore is this idea of the need to help those at the bottom. And in Singapore, we never really had that. So in 2004 in Singapore, this whole issue of income inequality hadn't become such a big public policy issue yet. And so it kind of surprised me meeting people and having conversations and them criticizing Singapore's system and saying that our system is unfair. And actually, the truth of it is that the Malaysians are right. So all the Malaysians that I spoke to in 2004 who told me that, you may not like our Bumiputra system, but the Singapore system isn't the best in the world either. They actually, in a sense, were proved right because income inequality has become probably the biggest policy issue that we have in Singapore today. So, it was just interesting for me to be able to talk to people then and actually have them show me things about my own country that I didn't actually realize being a slightly naive, ignorant, proud Singaporean back then.
So you use the terms equality of opportunity and equality of outcome in your book, and I've seen that in some of your other articles as well. And you say how that both have come at their own costs, and you say there's more pressure for Malaysia and Singapore to be more like each other. At what stage of that process do you think we're at right now?
I think becoming more like each other, what I necessarily mean is in the way we sort of treat minority groups in society, right? So in Malaysia, I think there's a big push to treat the Chinese and Indian minorities better. This has been going on for the past 7 to 8 years. You can look back at the Hindraft movement. You can look back at 2008 general elections. You can look at Pakatan Rakyat talking about Ketuanan Rakyat rather than Ketuanan Melayu. So this has been going on in Malaysia now for several years. Probably it's happened in Malaysia well before it's happened in Singapore. So in Singapore, when I talk about more concern for minorities, what I mean is a greater focus on the people at the bottom. And in Singapore, we've seen this, most definitely in the last 2 years, particularly since the last general election in 2011. So I think in both countries, you have the shift happening, but at the same time, you have a lot of resistance. So in Malaysia, obviously, you have a lot of quarters of the Malay nationalist community who, still believe very strongly in Ketuanan Melayu and the NEP and the fact that, Malays have to be given preferences in many different spheres of life. And some of the racial rhetoric that we've seen, in the aftermath of your GE 2013, is evidence of this. In Singapore, the same thing. In Singapore, even though there's a growing movement to sort of focus attention on the people at the bottom, you also have a lot of resistance amongst people who believe that, the Singapore system works perfectly. We should just let give people as level a playing field as we can when they start off life, but then after that, leave them to their own devices. So there's a lot of resistance here as well. I think in some ways we're just at the beginning of that process, and it's probably going to be in both countries. It's probably going to be a multi-decade process. I mean, I don't see the Bumiputra policies or this idea. At a larger level, it's the idea that Malaysia is primarily for Malays and the Chinese and Indians and the other ethnic groups are sort of secondary. I don't see this idea going away anytime soon. It's going to be a multi-decade process. Same thing in Singapore. It's going to be a multi-decade process. before Singaporeans really accept that we need to help those at the bottom a lot more.
Now, you talked earlier about how we're both at the start of that process, but the 2008 elections in Malaysia were the worst then, right? Worst performance then, came as a surprise, political tsunami. And then in 2011, during Singapore's GE, it was also the worst performance for the PAP. So what do you see the connection? Is there a connection there? Did the results of Malaysia's elections then affect Singapore's elections then? Then how do we apply that to the elections now? So how will the GE13 results affect Singapore, if at all?
I think there certainly is some connection, but I don't want to overstate the connection. So I think, Singaporeans have been observing Malaysian politics with great interest for the past 5 years. It's often the most exciting, saucy part of our newspaper to open and read about Malaysian politics. Also because the Singaporean newspapers, they actually write quite well on Malaysia and the rest of Southeast Asia, but for obvious reasons, they are a lot less critical of when they write about Singapore itself. So it's been very interesting reading about Malaysia, and I think a lot of Singaporeans have been watching democratic developments there with great interest, everything from the rise of Pakatan Rakyat to the Bersih movement. And I think some people have maybe been a bit emboldened by what they've seen across the causeway. But at the same time, I don't want to overstate this connection, because I think there are larger forces at play in both countries. I think in both countries you've seen policy missteps. In both countries you've seen the emergence of more credible opposition candidates. In both countries you've seen the internet being used a lot more by people who before wouldn't have had a voice. This includes many in the opposition, but also many other parts of society. So you've had these developments that have affected both countries. There is some connection between the election. I don't want to overstate it, and it's also worth bearing in mind that there sometimes is a negative impact on Singapore by Malaysia's democratic development. So, for instance, whenever there's a bit of chaos, whether it's the Bersih rally or whether it's some of the violent incidents that we saw in the lead up to this last election, you'll get a whole bunch of Singapore establishment, conservative people, pointing to Malaysia and saying, look, that's why we do not want democracy, right? That's why democracy is bad. See what happens when you have democracy. So, there are two opposing impacts, whenever there's a democratic liberalization in Malaysia, and so there is a connection, but I think we shouldn't overstate it. I think both countries, you're seeing liberalizations for similar reasons, which apply.
Okay, but so I've read a op-ed recently which asked if the results of Malaysia's GE13 is bad news for the Singapore government. I'm going to read you a paragraph from Maria Mokhtar's op-ed titled Singapore Friend or Foe. Now she wrote, Singapore has every right to be scared if UMNO Baru were ousted. The brain drain would stop. If working conditions in Malaysia were improved, the daily migration of workers to Singapore would be stemmed and Singapore might suffer a shortage of workers. If corruption was reduced, Malaysia would attract more foreign investment. What do you think about this paragraph?
I don't really agree with that. And the main reason is that I think, it's definitely in Singapore's interest to see a strong, healthy, corruption-free, economically developed Malaysia. Singapore economic future, you could argue social future as well, is intimately tied to Malaysia's. So, instead of viewing Malaysia as a competitor for foreign investment, I know some economists do, and obviously this op-ed commentator does as well. I think we should see the whole region as being a potential competitor for the likes of India and China. I think it's in everybody's interest in this part of the world to strengthen Malaysia's democracy and strengthen Malaysia's foreign investment climate and economic development. You can look at the Iskandar project as well. I think Singapore's future success is once again fairly dependent on the success of Iskandar. In many ways, the problems Singapore faces right now are because it's become such an expensive place. some people in certain vocations can't afford to consume services here anymore. If actually Iskandar takes off the way its proponents hope it will, I think that will be of a huge benefit to Singapore. We could see a lot more economic activity in this region, which will draw in a lot more investment. So I disagree actually with the op-ed, because I think it's very much in Singapore's interest to have a healthy, well-governed, corruption-free Malaysia. It's going to benefit the whole region, at a micro level, the region of Malaya, but at a bigger level, if you look at Southeast Asia and the ASEAN Economic Community, which is due to kick off in 2015, it's going to strengthen the whole region. So, I think it's good for Singapore.
So I guess you're also kind of saying for us to kind of stop setting Malaysia and Singapore against each other and look at larger regional changes as well. Because I think there's this tendency to compare Malaysia to Singapore and I guess Singapore to Malaysia in that sibling rivalry term that you use in your book.
Yeah. I think there's a lot we can learn from each other, right? I think in terms of governance, in terms certain aspects of economic development, certain aspects of attracting foreign investment. I think there's a lot Malaysia can learn from Singapore. Similarly, I think there's a lot that Singapore can learn from Malaysia as well. And this gets back to the way we treat minorities, specifically, economic minorities, the people at the bottom of the food chain. But also, one thing I mentioned in my book is Malaysians seem to generally live a much more balanced life, and I think that's another thing that Singaporeans can learn. In Singapore, everything is about what we call pragmatic objectives and achievements in life. Your school, your job, your career, money. And in Malaysia, I found most people to have a much broader set of objectives and achievements that they wanted in life, whether it's family or health or the ability to enjoy the great outdoors. So I think philosophically that there's a lot that Singaporeans can learn from Malaysians as well. So I think there's a lot we can both learn from each other, but we shouldn't have this sort of a zero-sum mentality where if Malaysia wins some foreign investment, it's going to be bad for Singapore and vice versa. I think both countries actually should work together for the brighter future of Malaya as a whole.
Now you use that term again. I just want to ask you, do you ever see Malaysia and Singapore getting back together again?
I think in an ideal world, it would be great to have formal integration of some sort. Unfortunately, I think because of history and politics, it's going to be quite difficult. And there are a lot of question marks about what sort of a political system we are going to see in Malaysia. Obviously, if you look at the results of the last election, you've got UMNO as the one party that has won the most number of seats, but then in places 2, 3, and 4, you have 3 Pakatan Rakyat parties. The other Barisan Nasional parties have almost completely been obliterated, aside from the parties in East Malaysia. So it's I'm not sure what the future of race-based politics is in Malaysia, and it's very difficult to see how that political system can gel very easily with the political system that we have here in Singapore. So that's just one of the fundamental differences that might make formal integration very difficult. But I am very much an optimist in that I think even though we might never have formal integration, the success of the Iskandar project, I think, will allow informal integration. So, obviously, Malaysia and Singapore are huge trading partners for each other. But with Iskandar, I think we're going to see a lot more closer links in everything from day-to-day movements, people living in both countries and commuting and consuming services on either side. And so even though there may never be formal political integration again because of the fundamental difficulties, I think we're going to have a lot more informal integration. The Iskandar project could be a precursor for other sorts of collaboration between the two countries. And because of that informal integration, I think necessarily it will bring Malaysians and Singaporeans closer together, which will be I think for the benefit of both people and both countries.
Speaking of integration, before GE13 here, there were rumors spreading in Johor that if DAP won the state, that they'd rejoin the PAP in Singapore. Have you ever heard of whispers like this in Singapore as well? And how, as a Singaporean, how do you take it?
I have heard some people talk about this. So, Lim Kit Siang moving south, DAP's increased focus on the south, the worries about the southern Chinese, which includes Singapore as well. I have heard some people in Singapore talking about this as well, and talking about possible Malaysian reactions to this, and the way in which Malaysia might treat Singapore differently. Because of all this, I'm not, I think, Singapore has very little interest in being involved with Malaysian politics, and I at the same time, I've met people from the DAP, and I think they've all told me the same thing. They said they admire Singapore's economic development, but they don't really admire Singapore's political system, because we're also, for most of our history, been ruled by a authoritarian government, very similar to BN, which DAP obviously has been fighting for most of its history. So I think I'm not sure there are a lot of people in DAP who really admire every aspect of the PAP, because the PAP reminds them of BN in some respects. So I don't really, I think those are sort of conspiracy theories. I don't really, buy the connection, but I can see why people might think that, also given the historical links between PAP and DAP.
So I guess the rumors aren't just on this side of the border. All right, thank you very much.